I've always loved hunting. Ever since I was a kid, my dad would take me out into the woods every fall, teaching me how to track and stay still, how to be patient. But what happened a few years ago in the backwoods of upstate New York has made me rethink everything I thought I knew about the woods and about what's out there. It was just me and my buddy, Mike. We were deep into the forest, miles away from the nearest road, camped out for a long weekend. We'd scouted the area a few days before, and the sign was good. Fresh tracks, scat, and some signs of rutting activity. The perfect place to bag a deer. The first morning was uneventful, just the usual quiet. The kind of peace you can only find out there, surrounded by towering pines, with the early morning mist clinging to the ground. Mike and I split up to cover more ground, agreeing to meet up at the edge of a clearing by noon. I remember the silence. It was so thick. I've spent plenty of time in the woods, and I know the usual sounds, bird calls, the rustling of small animals. But that day was dead silent. Not a breeze, not a whisper of movement. I chalked it up to the early cold snap. Maybe the animals had settled in for the winter early. Around midday, I started making my way toward the clearing when I heard something strange. A twig snap in the distance, followed by a low growl. I froze. The sound didn't come from any animal I knew. It wasn't the usual distant bark of a coyote or the soft huff of a deer. It was something else, something wrong. I called out for Mike, but there was no response. I checked my phone, but of course, there was no signal. I felt a sense of unease growing in the pit of my stomach. I'd been hunting in these woods for years, and I had never felt this way before. I decided to make my way back to camp, figuring Mike had heard something similar and was probably on his way back too. But as I walked through the woods, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The tracks. They weren't deer tracks. They were human. The footprints were big, too big to be normal, and they seemed to be circling, coming closer to where I was standing. I crouched down, trying to make sense of it. The ground was soft from the recent rain, and the impressions in the mud were deep, like someone or something had been standing there for a while. That's when I heard it again. A low growl, much closer this time. My heart started pounding in my chest, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone anymore. I turned and sprinted back toward camp, hoping to find Mike. But as I got closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The campfire was still burning, but the tent was gone. Not collapsed, gone. Vanished. No trace of it, no sign of struggle, just the half-burned embers of the fire flickering in the wind. I yelled out for Mike again, but still no answer. Panic started to set in. I grabbed my rifle and started walking in ever-widening circles around the camp, searching for any sign of him. That's when I saw the figure. In the distance, near the tree line, I caught a glimpse of something. Tall, really tall. The shape of it was blurry, but it was standing unnaturally still, like it was waiting for me to notice it. I called out again, my voice cracking. No response. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the trees, burning into my soul. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what. I didn't wait to find out. I ran. I ran like I've never run before, stumbling over roots and rocks, desperately trying to put distance between me and whatever was out there. I don't know how long I ran, but when I finally reached the car, I didn't even think. I just jumped in, started the engine, and drove as fast as I could out of the woods. I didn't tell anyone what happened that day. I couldn't. How could I explain the fear? The way the trees seemed to close in around me, the feeling that something was watching me, I still don't know what it was in those woods, but I'll tell you this, I've never been back. Mike's body was found a few days later, a few miles from where we were camped. His neck was broken. There was no sign of struggle, no tracks. The sheriff called it an unexplained death. But I know better. Whatever it was out there, whatever killed Mike, is still in those woods. And if you ever find yourself hunting in the backcountry, remember, some things in the forest don't want to be found. I've been an avid hunter for as long as I can remember. My dad took me on my first hunting trip when I was a kid, and ever since, I've spent almost every fall out in the woods, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. But there's one trip that still haunts me, and I can't shake it. It happened last November. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, a solo hunt deep in the Appalachian woods. I knew the area like the back of my hand. The kind of peace you get out there is unmatched. But this time, something was different. I didn't know it yet, but that peaceful solitude would soon turn into something far more sinister. I set out early, before dawn, and spent the morning tracking signs of deer. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but I chalked it up to the cold, overcast weather. By mid-afternoon, I found a nice spot near an old stream, where I decided to set up for the night. I wasn't expecting much, but it had been a while since I'd spent a full night in the woods alone, and I figured I'd enjoy the peace. That's when I started to feel it, a creeping unease, something just outside the edge of my awareness. I couldn't put my finger on it. There were no animals rustling in the brush, no birds calling, just this heavy silence. I thought it was odd, but I brushed it off. After all, it was just the weather playing tricks on me, right? As night fell, I settled into my tent, listening to the distant sounds of the forest, the wind, the occasional snap of a twig. But then I heard something else. It was faint at first, a kind of whispering noise coming from the trees. I couldn't make it out, but it sounded like voices, or maybe just the wind. I couldn't tell, but my gut told me something was wrong. I checked my rifle, even though I hadn't seen any signs of anything dangerous in the area. I tried to settle in, but I kept hearing it. The voices. They weren't getting any louder, but they were definitely there. I decided to go out and investigate, thinking maybe it was other hunters. It was the only logical explanation, right? I grabbed my flashlight, slowly unzipped the tent, and stepped out into the cold, dense fog that had rolled in. The air smelled damp and earthy. I clicked on my light and scanned the trees. Nothing. No movement. No figures. Just the dense shadows of the woods stretching out in every direction. But then, I noticed something odd. A set of fresh tracks in the mud, too big to be deer prints. They looked human, but something was off. Too wide, too deep. I followed the tracks for what felt like miles, until the trees seemed to close in around me. The whispers were louder now, clearer. They weren't human voices, not really. More like growling, muttering, as if something were mocking me. My heart started to race. Something wasn't right, and I should have turned back. But curiosity got the better of me. That's when I saw it. Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of a figure, tall, unnaturally thin, with long, spindly arms that reached out toward the ground. I froze, my blood running cold. It didn't look human, not by any stretch of the imagination. The creature's face was gaunt, its eyes too wide, too white, and as I stared at it, it turned its head toward me. I've never felt fear like that before. The kind of fear that makes your limbs freeze, your mouth go dry, like your body knows it's in mortal danger even before your brain processes what's happening. but there was no mistaking it. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't friendly. I ran. I don't know how long I ran, but I didn't stop until I was back at my camp. My heart was pounding in my chest. I could barely breathe. My hands shook as I grabbed my rifle and checked the chamber, trying to calm myself. But then, through the fog, I saw it again. The creature was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. I don't know how long it stood there, but it didn't move, didn't make a sound. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was stare back at it. Finally, it turned and vanished into the woods, like it had never been there at all. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers never stopped, and the creature never left my thoughts. I packed up and left before dawn, and I haven't been back to those woods since. Sometimes, when I'm out hunting, I think I hear those same whispers in the distance. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I see shadows moving between the trees, just on the edge of my vision. But when I look, there's nothing there. I don't know what I saw that night, or what it wanted, but I'm certain of one thing: I'll never go back. Whatever it was, it's still out there waiting, and I don't think I'm the only one it's watching. I'm not much of a hunter, never have been. But a few years ago, I was talked into going on a trip with some friends, guys I grew up with mostly. They were seasoned hunters, and I was just tagging along for the ride, hoping for a weekend out of the city and maybe a chance to bond with them. We drove up to a cabin in the woods, hours away from the nearest town. The place was old, rustic, no Wi-Fi, no cell service, nothing but the deep silence of the forest. The first night was fine. We sat around the fire, drank beer, and swapped stories. I was a little on edge, sure. Being that deep in the woods will do that to you. But nothing felt out of the ordinary. It was the second day when things started to get weird. We'd been hunting all morning, trudging through thick underbrush and damp forest floor. The woods were dense, too dense at times, and even though I was trying to enjoy myself, I kept feeling like something was watching us. I can't explain it, but every time I looked around, the trees seemed a little too still, the shadows a little too thick. By mid-afternoon, I was exhausted and ready to head back to the cabin, but the guys were determined to push on. They had spotted some deer tracks earlier, and they insisted we'd get a shot at one if we kept going. So reluctantly, I followed along, trudging deeper into the woods. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe some animal moving through the trees. But then it came again, a low, guttural sound, like something was breathing, but not right. It was too deep, too labored. I turned to the guys, but they didn't seem to notice. They were focused, scanning the ground for signs of game. So I tried to shrug it off, but the sound kept coming, closer now. I was trying to stay calm, trying to tell myself it was just an animal, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I could feel it. Whatever it was following us. The sound wasn't random anymore. It was deliberate. It was moving with us. I didn't want to panic, so I stayed quiet, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. My heart started to race as I realized we were completely isolated. No one could hear us. That's when one of the guys, Mark, froze. He held up his hand, signaling for us to stop. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We all went silent, and sure enough, there it was again. The sound of heavy breathing, close now. It wasn't just in the trees anymore. It was in the air around us, almost near. Then, without warning, a sharp snap echoed through the forest. Someone, stepped on a branch, loud enough to make us all jump. I felt my stomach drop. We weren't alone. Mark motioned for us to stay quiet and crouched down low, peering through the underbrush. For what felt like hours, we didn't move. We waited, breathless, the sound of whatever was out there still circling us. But nothing happened. No footsteps, no more snapping branches. Just silence. The guys weren't saying anything now. They were all scanning the woods with wide eyes clearly shaken. Finally, Mark spoke up. "We're going back, now." We didn't argue. We turned around and started walking back the way we came. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us, getting closer with every step. The air was thick, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, just before we broke out of the tree line, I heard it again, right behind me, that horrible, ragged breathing. But this time, it was different. It sounded like it was laughing. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there, not a trace. The woods were still. The air was cold. The guys, thankfully, didn't hear it. We made it back to the cabin without incident, but none of us slept that night. We stayed up in shifts, nervously watching the woods, listening for any sign of movement. But nothing came. The next day, we packed up and left, without even finishing the hunt. No one spoke about what happened, but we all knew. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something was out there that night. I don't go near those woods anymore, and I don't think I ever will. If you're ever deep in the forest and you hear that sound, breathing, like it's right behind you, don't look back, just run.